Hi, I'm Brian with BibleStudying.net, and in this video we're going to be talking about Taoism and how it also holds in common all these four doctrinal points that we've been using to categorize similarities between these various religions. So let's start with the first doctrinal point, and that is the mystical path to truth. Where does Taoism fall in this particular doctrine? Well, according to Britannica, Taoism, like all other forms of Eastern mysticism, distinguishes itself from Western mysticism by its conscious techniques of mind and body designated to introduce trance and to give access to mystical experience. Merriam-Webster's Online Dictionary simply defines Taoism as a Chinese mystical philosophy. So certainly Taoism can fall into this particular category, sharing this particular doctrine. In addition, I want to read another quote on it, on Lao Tzu, who's the founder. World Book says that the Tao Te Ching describes the Tao, or Way, which is the unity of nature. And this unity can be understood only by mystical intuition. So very much we can categorize it, along with these other religions, as mystical. Number two, this doctrine of the one that is all. What does Taoism have to say on this? Well, Taoism actually is going to be fairly articulate about this particular point. According to Merriam-Webster's, the Tao itself, from which we get the term Taoism, the Tao is the unconditional and unknowable source and guiding principle of all reality as conceived of by Taoists. In addition, Encyclopedia Britannica, in their 2004 deluxe edition, goes into a little bit more specificity, more detail. It says in the article on Taoism that Lao Tzu calls this the permanent Tao, which in reality is nameless, that the Tao is outside categories, it is something formlessly fashioned. Its name we do not know. Tao is imperceptible, indiscernible, about which nothing can be predicated, but that it latently contains the forms, entities, and forces of all particular phenomenon. So it's definitely the one that is all, in that sense. They go on to say that the nameless and the named, which is not being and being, are interdependent and grow out of one another, and that they're not identical. So there's this idea of being and non-being, sort of maybe a little bit more dualistically divided, but still interdependent. And we've seen that there's dualistic themes already existing in this mystical global religion anyways, in the form of Zoroaster. We'll see it in some others later, such as Gnosticism. It goes on here to describe that not being does not mean nothingness, but rather the absence of perceptible qualities, and in Lao Tzu's view, it is superior to being. And so the idea here basically is that you have, of course, being and non-being intertwined with one another. The non-being is even higher, more superior, because it's formless, it hasn't taken on any kind of particular qualities yet, and that's the sort of one that is all, out of which comes everything else in the phenomenological universe that we experience. And so it's the source for everything. It is the one that is all. Next, we'll talk about a little bit here from the Columbia Encyclopedia and what they had to say on Lao Tzu. That he taught the idea of passive and intuitive behavior in a natural harmony with the Tao, a cosmic unity underlying all phenomena. So definitely this idea of a cosmic unity, a one that is all, that is a part of every phenomenon that takes place. Next, we want to talk about reincarnation. According to Linda Edwards in her book, A Brief Guide to Beliefs, Lao Tzu taught a belief in the transmigration of souls which became absorbed into Taoism. And so definitely they believe in reincarnation. And Encyclopedia Britannica says similarly that in Taoism, life and death are but a pair of cyclical phases, and that all beings are essentially one, as we saw a moment ago with this idea of the one that is all. And so there is, in the process of being and non-being, becoming and dying, there is this cyclical process of rebirth and death, according to Taoism. So they definitely agree with reincarnation as well. In addition, let's talk about their definition of salvation. What do the Taoists believe about salvation? Well, in Taoism, according again to Linda Edwards, all nature is united in the Tao. Therefore, emancipation and salvation are not concerned with escaping nature, but in directing the forces of nature in your own body. And we'll talk a little bit about this distinction with Taoism here in just a second. According to Britannica, the perfect man has become indistinguishable from them and shares the immortality and infinity which is above the cycle of ordinary life and death. And when it says has become indistinguishable from them, it's referring to the Tao itself. basically, and others who have attained union with the Tao. So the idea here is that you want to attain union with the Tao, because of course the Tao is this sort of underlying source for everything of which we are a part. And the difference here, particularly for Taoism, is say one of these other reformations of this sort of Hindu religion or proto-Hindu religion, is that Taoism doesn't believe you just have to wait until you somehow escape from the cycle of rebirth in order to attain this union, but that in yourself you can attain a sort of stillness that will allow you to have direct access now in this life to that union that you desire. In fact, Britannica says a little bit more about this, and it says, for the individual, and this is the article on Taoism, the individual wisdom is to conform to the rhythm of the universe, and the mystic, the Taoist mystic, creates a void inside himself that permits him to return to nature's origin. And so the idea here is that, as it says, in ecstasy he escaped the rhythm of life and death by contemplating the universal return, and having attained perfect emptiness, he's able to basically have access to totality. And so you don't have to wait till you sort of permanently escape, never to be reborn again, but in the process of life and death itself, while you're here, you can have moments of stillness through mystical meditation that allow you to, at those moments, touch into this union and experience it now, before you then go back to the rest of your normal life. So a slight modification there, but still the same basic definition and understanding of escape as union back with the one that is all, and as sort of something that's a temporary escape from the cycle of rebirth and death that you can experience right now. So next we want to turn our attention to Plato and Platonism, and talk a little bit about how it also, although we're not talking about an Eastern religion anymore, we're talking about a Western phenomenon, it's typically regarded as a philosophy, it's actually got all of these same four components in common with what we call these Eastern religions. So does Platonism believe in a mystical path to truth? Well, according to Britannica, Platonism at a particular point in time, a certain Gnostic relating to intuitive knowledge rather than sort of experience or empirical knowledge or reasoning, a certain Gnostic or intuitive knowledge, tone or coloring sometimes may be discerned in the thought of Plotinus. Well, Plotinus was the sort of 3rd century AD leader of what became known as Neoplatonism. And so definitely there is that element, at least in Neoplatonism, but also it's there in Platonism as well. According to the Columbia Encyclopedia, when it's talking about Neoplatonism, it describes it simply as an ancient mystical philosophy based on the doctrines of Plato. So definitely we're getting some cues here that tell us that this is a mystical worldview as a mystical approach to knowledge. But let's talk a little bit more here. Under Britannica's article on Platonism, they describe how the supreme principle is absolutely simple and undetermined. Very much sounds like the language we just saw with Taoism. It's devoid of specific traits, and therefore man's knowledge of it must be radically different from any other kind of knowledge. Hence it cannot be known, it can be known only if it raises the mind to an immediate union with itself which cannot be imagined or described. And so, again, we see something very similar to what we saw in Taoism, although this is Britannica's article on Platonism, talking about the way to restore union between yourself and the supreme being, the supreme one that is all, as we'll see here in further quotes, is through a sort of internal meditative mystical process and mystical awareness. Next, let's look a little bit more here from what Britannica has to say in their Western philosophy article. Plato believed that the only way you can know reality is essentially through this idea of contemplating these forms, these eternal forms. And in his later dialogues, Britannica specifically says that Plato criticizes an empiricist theory of knowledge. So that's very important because it means he's rejecting reason and evidence as the means to knowledge. Lastly, the quote here from Encyclopedia Britannica states, "The physical world, according to Plato, is perceived with the senses. It's in a constant state of flux, and knowledge derived from it is restricted and variable. But the realm of forms is apprehensible only by the mind, and it's eternal and changeless." So definitely we know that Platonism is a mystical worldview. So we'll come back and we'll look at Platonism then concerning the other doctrines that we've been examining in the next video.